Brilliant. I will make a start. So thank you everybody for joining us today. We're really looking forward to today's webinar, which will be an introduction to our new programme, GRACE-Epi. I'm Rachel Marshall. I'm the Communications and Impact Manager in the Social Biobehavioural Research Group at UCL. And I'm delighted to be supporting GRACE-Epi, which has officially launched this month, and we're so excited to share it with you. So I'm going to give a quick introduction to this webinar series before handing over to our speaker for today, Professor Daisy Fancourt. So this webinar is being held as part of the GRACE-Epi Monthly Methods series. And GRACE-Epi is a major new programme of work on arts and health, which you're going to be hearing a lot more about from Daisy today. Throughout this GRACE-Epi programme, we're engaging in open and collaborative science. And so we're hosting monthly free training webinars, which are exploring different novel methodologies, theoretical approaches, lenses, all in partnership with different universities globally. We're recording today's webinar and future webinars, so they'll all be available to watch back for free on our website following the event. And we have details of our next event in February already live, so you're welcome to check that out. We'll be hearing from Professor Agustin Ibanez on the topic of a multi-aging clocks framework to study arts, culture and brain health. And that's happening on the 26th of February, and we'll be following up after the event to share how you can register for that. But if you want to stay in touch with all of the kind of future webinars we'll be hosting, then do subscribe to our research group's newsletter, as that will be a hub for information moving forward. Next slide, please. Just to say as well, on this upcoming webinar series, we're really keen to get proposals for speakers. So we're planning the schedule for the rest of 2026. And we'd love to hear from you if you're interested in getting involved. We think it's a hopefully really exciting opportunity to have your work spotlighted as part of this global research programme and connect with different colleagues across countries and different disciplines. So if you have work that you'd like to share that's perhaps a novel methodology, a theoretical approach or a different lens, then do get in touch. It could be quantitative or qualitative research, and it also could be from a wide range of disciplines, but that would be transferable to the field of arts and health. So that's my email address on the screen. And if you'd like to find out more and express your interest in getting involved as a speaker, then please get in touch. But onto today's session, we'll shortly be hearing from Professor Daisy Fancourt, who will be providing an introduction to the GRACE-Epi programme and the innovative methods that the research team will be using over the coming years. And Daisy's presentation will be followed by a question and answer session. So please do use the Q&A function to share any questions throughout, and we'll pick those up towards the end of the session. I will also try and endeavour to keep up with comments in the chat as well. So if you have questions that you want to add in there or comments or want to share things, then please do go ahead. And we're hoping it will be a useful opportunity for you to connect with others. But finally, from me, as by way of introduction, so Daisy is a professor of psychobiology and epidemiology and head of our research group here at UCL. Her research focuses on the effects of social connections and behaviours on health. She is the director of the World Health Organization Collaborating Centre on Arts and Health and of the National Centre for Social Prescribing Data and Analysis. She is listed by Clarivate as one of the most highly cited scientists in the world, having published over 300 peer-reviewed papers, given more than 40 keynotes, and her latest book, Art Cure, The Science of How the Arts Transform Our Health, was published actually earlier this month by Penguin and has achieved Amazon bestseller status and a selection as a top pick across countless book retailers already. So without further ado, I will hand over to you, Daisy.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for that lovely introduction. And it's so nice to be presenting this brand new research project to you. GRACE-Epi is an acronym for our new project, which is called Global Research on Arts and Cultural Engagement through Advancing Epidemiological Methods. And it's a grant that was awarded at the end of last year from the Wellcome Trust through their Discovery Awards scheme, which focus on pursuing bold and creative research ideas to deliver significant shifts in understanding relating to human health, life and well-being. So this is very much a big team effort, which comprises researchers across the UK, Malawi, Chile and Japan. In particular, I just want to acknowledge the other investigators on this grant with me, including Dr. Haywan Mak, Professor Agustin Ibanez, Dr. Sharifa Abdullah, Dr. Feifei Bu, Professor Noki Kondo, Albert Dubé and Professor Andrew Steptoe as well. And we've got a lovely map showing all of our smiley faces in the regions that we're particularly representing for this research project. As well as these investigators, we also have a whole team of researchers who will be working on the project, and we've got some amazing partners, including the Jameel Arts and Health Lab, the World Health Organization, and UNESCO, who are working with us a lot on the policy-facing aspects of this grant, as well as other organizations, including Global South Arts and Health Week, Global Cultural Districts Network, United Cities and Local Governments, Art and Global Health Centre Africa, and the African Population Cohort Consortium. And this grant also has a structure that's designed to help us continue interrogating our methods and approaches throughout, including global PPIE workshops, which are literally just about to kick off in the next couple of weeks, an international academic steering group, and also an international program advisory group. So it's, as you can see, quite a large machine. It's £3.5 million of funding over the next 7 years, which is a full economic cost grant of just over 10 million. So we've got a lot of research that we're going to be doing over that time span. And today I want to give you a kind of overview about what the project is going to involve, what research has led up to it, and particularly what research questions we then want to be answering over the next 7 years, and how we're going to be working to try and maximise the impact of the research across the whole grant as well. So some of you in the field may be familiar with this WHO Arts and Health report that we published 7 years ago now, which was considering the role that the arts can play within health from a prevention and promotion perspective, as well as in the management and treatment of illness. What we identified in the report is broadly known anyway, is that arts engagement is ubiquitous across every human culture throughout human history, often actually closely intertwined with health and healing practices. But it's only been really in the last few decades that we've had the scientific evidence to understand this much more. And this evidence base has consisted of rich qualitative and ethnographic research, laboratory experiments, and clinical trials. Over the last 2 years, the investigators on this grant have been variously collaborating in different guises on new commissions on arts and health from the Lancet and also from Nature journals, which I think is a strong sign of the growing interest in this field from the scientific community as well. And when we talk about arts and health, though, what we've noticed in particular is that a lot of the literature still focuses on specific arts and health interventions like arts therapies. So really we can conceptualize the field as being on this spectrum from the kind of engagement that we might do in the arts day to day, just for the pure enjoyment of it within our homes or communities or schools, through to more public health focused programs that could include things like arts on prescription or social prescribing, through to the most clinical end where we actually have arts interventions developed as treatments within specific clinical pathways. But it is much more on this right-hand end of the spectrum that we've had a lot of research, particularly focusing on arts therapies. But there is this question that we've had increasingly as we've been looking at the evidence base of what about those other aspects of day-to-day engagement? So those activities that people do in their own time, often typically as leisure activities, but what are the long-term health outcomes that might be associated with those behaviours? Essentially, this is asking the question of, is arts engagement in day-to-day life actually a health behaviour? So something that has inherent health benefits regardless of why we might be engaging with it, akin to things like diet and physical activity, for example. And the way that we can conceptualize this in a kind of rough theoretical model is to consider that arts engagements can comprise different components that can be beneficial to health. So some of these are things that actually we can get through other activities as well. So physical activity, cognitive stimulation, social interaction. But there are also other components that can be particularly strongly expressed in arts engagement. So things like multisensory stimulation, creativity, imagination, aesthetics, for example. And the theoretical models that have been developing from this have been proposing that this combination of components that are involved in arts behaviours activate various psychological, biological, social and behavioural processes that then lead to health outcomes. So this could be things like emotional expression, meaning making, biological stress regulation, social connections and social identity, mastery and self-efficacy, etc., all of which support our health. Now, naturally, we're not proposing that arts engagement is any kind of panacea within this, but it's in the same way that we recognize that physical activity, for example, doesn't always end up in positive health benefits. And there are plenty of examples as well where we can see direct evidence of harm. So, for example, overuse amongst professional musicians that we see, particular art forms that might be triggering or might be associated with adverse mental health outcomes, and also the natural consequences of programs if they're not effectively designed in order to consider safeguarding, for example. But nonetheless, kind of taking account of these caveats, I think what we're proposing and we're seeing emerging much more in the literature around health behaviours is, can arts engagement as that day-to-day behaviour actually have these accumulating health benefits if people are engaging regularly? Naturally, the challenge, of course, is how to research this. And this is where the epidemiology side, which is the methodological focus of this grant, comes into play. Because there are, in fact, dozens of cohort studies around the world which involve representative samples of individuals who've been tracked across years or decades of their lives, often from birth, which have actually organically included questions on arts engagement over their histories of collecting data. And these cohort studies are really amazing resources because not only are they typically large representative samples of people, but they also gather thousands of other variables that will consider people's demographics, their lifestyle, their education and socioeconomic position, the other kinds of behaviours they're engaging with, and also lots of clinical data, including biomarker data, including neuroimaging, including medical records. So they're a fantastic resource to be able to look at this day-to-day engagement and how it relates to outcomes. Now, Wellcome funding over the last 8 years has been really pivotal in helping us to develop the initial evidence base on arts using epidemiological methods. So Wellcome has funded us on a series of projects that have enabled us to look at UK cohort studies demonstrating long-term associations between arts engagement and diverse mental and physical health outcomes. And this has been supplemented by grants that we at UCL have received from a number of other sources, particularly in the US, and that also other teams around the world have received to look in some other countries too. So just to give you a kind of example of type of research that's come out of this to date, in terms of mental health, there are plenty of smaller scale studies that have demonstrated that arts engagement can improve people's well-being and their mental health. But actually being able to show this at scale from people's day-to-day engagement is where epidemiological methods have come in. So using cohort data in the UK, research that's led by Haywan Mak, one of the investigators on this grant that we undertook together, looked at over 40 different types of arts and cultural engagement that people take part in day to day, and then considered if people increased this arts engagement, was that related to changes in their well-being? And we found that both for arts participation, so actually directly doing arts, as well as going to cultural venues and events, increasing levels of arts led to reductions in mental distress, mental functioning, and improvements in mental functioning and improvements in life satisfaction. Now, naturally, the really big issue and challenge with epidemiology is considering cause and effect, given that these are observational data sets where people are tracked over time rather than direct experimental methods that we would see through randomized control trials, for example. But epidemiology is very much a statistical discipline. So the work that we and others have undertaken has involved essentially mapping all of the different confounding factors that could in fact explain that association between arts engagement and the health outcomes, and then building these into our statistical models in various different ways, some of which are just simply accounting for conditioning on these confounders, other of which are using methods where individuals are compared against themselves, which organically removes confounders that are stable, even if they are unmeasured or even unidentified. And also other methods that we're increasingly starting to work in that might be trying to emulate some of the conditions that we would see in more experimental research, but using observational data. Another thing that we're able to do with these epidemiological methods is to consider the issue of prevention. So essentially whether engagement in arts as a behaviour reduces the risk of somebody developing mental or physical health conditions later on. So for example, for depression, we ran a study looking at adults over the age of 50 who didn't have any depression, had no history of depression, and weren't having any medication or any other signs that they might be experiencing subclinical symptoms of depression, for example. And we found that when we looked at rates of cultural engagement, so going to cultural events and performances, the more people were engaged in cultural activities, the lower the incidence rate that they had of depression over the following 10 years. So people who were engaged once a month or more, only around 2 in every 100 developed depression each year over the following decade, compared to 5 in 100 amongst those who were never engaged. And this equated to around a 48% lower odds once we take an account of all of those confounding factors. These are just a couple of examples that we've looked at in relation to mental health, but actually there's a lot of research that we've also, and other teams have undertaken, looking at aspects of physical health as well. I'm not going to go into the details because we've published on this in other places and done other webinars specifically on these findings that are available on our websites. But just to give a kind of example of some of the findings, we found that arts engagement is related to a lower incidence rate of chronic pain over the following 10 to 12 years in older adults, with actually similar effect sizes that we see to physical activity, something that we are more used to talking about as a health behaviour in relation to chronic pain outcomes. We've seen that people who are regularly engaged in arts and cultural engagement actually have lower risks of developing frailty. They tend to be older when they do become frail, and they also have slower trajectories of frailty progression. And crucially, this is even when we've accounted for other hobbies, physical activity, and social interactions that they're having in their lives. There's also a large body of research now that's been identifying associations between arts engagement and preservation of cognitive function. In some of these analyses, we've even combined, we've looked at combinations of physician-diagnosed dementia and also probable dementia using people's scores on neurocognitive batteries, and found that people who are more regularly engaged in arts have a longer time free from dementia before they start to show cognitive symptoms, which very much aligns with literature on the concept of cognitive reserve, the building of cognitive resilience against declines in dementia. And there are even now over a dozen studies that show associations between arts engagements and longer lifespans, even when accounting for very diverse confounders and even when considering stratified populations. So in other words, people who might be in lower socioeconomic as well as higher socioeconomic groups. So this just gives a kind of illustration of some of the studies that have been conducted. There are now, we think about 150 epidemiological papers on arts and health that have been published. We're actually in the process of systematically reviewing all of them with the World Health Organization at the moment. And some of these papers are really exciting as well because they enable us to think more about issues like health economics. So considering if we can actually put financial values to some of those improvements that we see, then actually what does this suggest in terms of a return on investment from funding arts within communities? So work that I did with the Department for Culture, Media and Sport over the last couple of years, we looked at monetizing the wellbeing improvements that you see, which can be directly translated into pound values through the Treasury's Green Book, as well as considering any health and social care costs that are avoided through people engaging in arts and maintaining better health and well-being, and also changes in productivity. Just as one example from this report that we published just over a year ago, for mental health in working age adults alone, current rates of arts participation in the UK are valued at just nearly £16 billion per year. And the Welsh Arts Council Wales has just published last week a piece where they directly calculated the return on investment using this algorithm, this method in Wales. And it was finding an 11-to-1 return on investment from the funding that they currently distribute through Arts Council Wales. So this can generate research that can be quite impactful in terms of policy design as well. However, we do have a challenge, which is that to date, virtually all of the epidemiology papers on arts and health have come from Western, Global North and high-income countries. And this is a really big challenge for us to consider because we have to ask, can we really talk about the arts as a health behaviour if 90% of this evidence base has come from basically 9 countries representing 6% of the world's population? We're very aware that people engage, define, value the arts differently in different cultural contexts. And we have to be really questioning then, do we see these same associations between arts and health outcomes in these other cultural contexts? And naturally, as scientists, we have a question about what if our focus to date on limited countries means that we might be missing core confounding biases that might exist in other countries that we've not taken account of? Or actually, could there be different conceptualizations about art as a health behavior that we're missing at the moment because we're missing so much data? So that's why we proposed this GRACE-Epi Discovery Awards, because essentially we're hoping it will represent quite a radical rethink in terms of the concepts, methods, and equity in epidemiological work on arts and health. We feel that over the last decade, there's been a lot of building of the credibility and the actual ability to conduct epidemiological research on the arts. But this now puts us in a really exciting position where we can start to really interrogate the way that we're doing this and the kinds of results that we see. So we're really excited because we've succeeded in getting new questions on diverse arts engagements into Harvard's Longitudinal Global Flourishing Study, which is a 5-year longitudinal cohort, which is currently into its 3rd year now, and covers 22 countries that represent half of the world's population. And in addition, we've also identified 19 aging cohorts that contain rich questions and longitudinal follow-up of up to 30 years on arts engagement. So together, we actually now have longitudinal data on arts with long-term health outcomes from over 50 countries that between them represent 3/4 of the world's population. And this is going to be the big focus of the GRACE-Epi grant. We can't look at everything at once. So we're going to be focusing on older adults, which is a population facing major psychosocial challenges with high burdens of morbidity, causing increasing international concern to health services. But essentially, we're going to be asking, is arts engagement a behaviour that can support healthy ageing globally? And we have 4 work streams that we're going to be carrying out through the GRACE-Epi grant to do this. The first of which, work stream 1, is led by Sharifa, Albert, and Haywan, and it involves a year-long intensive series of co-production workshops interrogating the fundamental assumptions underpinning epidemiological research on the arts, like how do different countries define arts, including arts practices that might be embedded within everyday life rituals, folklore, and ceremony. What does healthy aging mean in different cultural contexts? So do some countries prioritize individualistic outcomes like psychological functioning, physical functioning, cognitive functioning? But in other countries, is there much more of a focus on things like contribution to society and resources like respect and wisdom? If we're really looking at the relationship between arts and healthy aging, we have to consider that full definition of what healthy aging means in these different contexts. And third, what are the factors that could act as confounders or moderators in this relationship that we have to be considering statistically within epidemiological research? So, for example, do wealth and education play an important role in every country, or are there others that we need to be considering as well, like religion, trust, or politics, for example? So to answer these questions, our international partners are already working with us at designing inclusive co-production workshops where we can answer some of these questions and develop new conceptual definitions and frameworks. And these workshops are going to be taking place as part of existing international festivals that are happening in various countries around the world this year. So we're latching onto these festivals and running these workshops as part of them. And we're particularly going to be working with older adults in different cultural contexts, as well as local cultural custodians. So those are the people within communities who lead arts practices, whether it's arts organisations and artists, or village leaders, or other people within positions of authority that lead that cultural work. We're then going to be working with our academic steering group to then map the incredibly rich variables that we have within the cohort data onto these conceptual frameworks so that we can identify where do we have the strongest data and how can we then design our analyses to make best use of those data. In workstream 2, Feifei, Tamara, and Noki will then be using these frameworks to conduct longitudinal analyses between arts and diverse aspects of healthy aging. One of the things that we're really pushing through GRACE-Epi is methodological development in the space. So we'll be using the latest in causal inference statistical methods and machine learning approaches. So this will include things like testing quite sophisticated counterfactuals, so control conditions compared to arts engagements, to try and isolate what it is about arts engagement that might be particularly beneficial. Testing bidirectionality within this, something that we've done in the past, but we want to do at a more global scale, We know that arts engagement, that health influences arts engagement, as well as arts engagement influencing health. And we want to be able to test which direction this is strongest in different cultural contexts. And then we also want to consider how we can combine the findings from different countries using meta-analytic and multi-level approaches. So overall, this work stream will allow us to ascertain if the findings are similar cross-culturally or if they're more complex and nuanced, for example, only found within certain cultures or dependent on individual or contextual factors within society. We've already done some proof of concept work on this work stream. So for example, we published a paper a couple of years ago in Nature Medicine, where we harmonized aging cohorts from 16 countries. And then we looked at creative hobby engagements and 4 different health outcomes. And as you can see, we looked longitudinally at the relationship between arts and the subsequent outcomes in each of the 16 countries. And then we meta-analyzed our own findings. And this was once we'd taken account of confounders. But we actually applied 6 different statistical methods in this paper and then triangulated the findings, actually demonstrating that regardless of which method was used, we were actually coming through with consistent outcomes, suggesting this wasn't merely an artifact of the particular bias within one particular statistical approach we were using. And some of the other preliminary work that we've done, again, has been thinking more about statistical methods. We published a paper last year where we considered how we could be drawing more on social ecological theory developments around confounders in order to design more sophisticated statistical modelling of arts engagement that takes account of these confounders in more robust ways. So we're going to be building on this methodological work within GRACE-Epi as well. But as well as going broader, we also want to go deeper, and this is where work stream 3 comes in. Because experimental studies show that there's diverse biological embedding of individual arts experiences across endocrine, immune, neurobiological, and cardiometabolic systems. And this is really exciting because it can provide more objective outcome data and also more biological plausibility to the health benefits that we see of the arts. So we want to expand this by undertaking a really radical new program of work, conducting the first ever molecular epidemiological studies of arts engagement. So 12 of the aging cohorts that we're planning to work with from 4 different continents have integrated large-scale molecular biomarker data into their data sets. So in workstream 3, Augustine and Andrew are the leads for work where we're going to be testing if arts engagement has a biological signature that is evident at pre-specified points in the omics cascade. Particularly, we're focusing on epigenomics, proteomics, metabolomics, and phenomics. And we're looking at this in 2 ways. We're looking at that signature, that biological signature associated with arts engagements, but then we're also interested in the relationship between arts and biological clocks that combine multiple biomarkers to look at accelerated versus decelerated aging. So this work stream will essentially reveal if and how arts engagement is related not only to the visible and perceived aspects of healthy aging that we're looking at in workstream 2, but also the underlying fundamental biological processes. We've actually got really excited and we've already started some of this work straight away because there are some sort of really nice examples of where we can test the methods in some of the data sets already. So Augustine has already published a paper which has been looking at arts engagement and how it relates to cognitive aging. So he used cohort data to demonstrate that amongst people who are more engaged in arts activities, they actually have enhanced connectivity in brain regions that are vulnerable to aging. So that dancers, musicians, visual artists, amateurs in all of these, but those who engage in those activities actually show delayed brain aging. We see this particularly then amongst the experts. So those who are engaged the most having brain aging, that brains that are younger than their chronological age. We've also been undertaking some of this work at UCL as well. We started off initially looking at, in pilot work, at how arts engagement was related to just panels of biomarkers that are available in the data set. So things like cardiovascular, metabolic, inflammatory, neuroendocrine, and anthropometric biomarkers in the cohort studies. So for example, we found that people who had patterns of greater arts engagement had lower sort of trait levels of blood pressure and pulse rate. They had lower levels of glycated hemoglobin, lower levels of cholesterol, and they also had lower levels of inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein, and better anthropometric outcomes like lower waist circumference and body mass index. But we've just recently started expanding this into considering broader panels of biomarker data, because the challenge with the other biomarker data is, for example, when we're looking at proteins, we've only been looking at sort of 3 or 4 at once. And this means that we're having to often rely on pre-specified hypotheses about which biomarkers do we think are likely to change based on the experimental data. But actually, one of the really exciting things that we can do with the high throughput molecular biomarker data in the cohorts is we can take a data-driven approach instead and say, across hundreds of proteins, which are the ones that are actually associated with arts engagement. So this allows us not to have those hypotheses initially, but to see which biomarkers show an association, and then to use bioinformatics approaches to identify which biological pathways are therefore implicated. So we've already started doing this in this paper, which has just gone under review. We found that there were some proteins like BCAN, for example, which is involved in cognition, which is really interesting because that actually is one of the outcomes that we see phenotypically arts engagement associated with cognitive outcomes. And some of this is corroborating experimental evidence already. So we're seeing that people who are regularly engaged in arts engagement have different downregulation of inflammatory protein pathways. Which corroborates what we've been seeing experimentally, but it's also allowing us to identify new biological pathways that hadn't been implicated in arts engagement before, that can now be put forward as candidates for experimental testing as well. And I mentioned briefly about some of the clocks that we want to look at as well within this work stream. We've just started doing some of this work in the cohorts. And we've been looking at 2 different types of clocks. One of these are physiological aging clocks, which combine biomarkers from different physiological systems like cardiovascular, respiratory, inflammatory, musculoskeletal, and circulatory, and use principal components approaches to construct indices of people's physiological age that we can then subtract from their chronological age to look at discrepancies. We found through this work that those who are involved more in cultural activities actually have a younger physiological age than those who aren't engaged, even when we've accounted for confounders, and they actually have a slower rate of aging over the subsequent 4 years as well. But we've also then looked at this at the opposite end of the omics cascade, so looking at epigenetic clocks, which combine data on methylation, DNA methylation at particular points in the genome to indicate whether people are older or younger epigenetically than their chronological age. And again, we found association between arts engagement and several of the most recent 2nd and 3rd generation epigenetic clocks. So these are very, very preliminary early findings, but I think it's really exciting that we're already seeing some things coming through, because it gives us a wonderful platform to develop this work stream over the next 7 years, and also hopefully to capitalize on the additional biomarker data that will no doubt become available during that 7-year follow-up time as well. And then our final work stream is considering how we can tie all of this work together. This is going to be an effort from all of the investigators working together on this, and we've got 3 main cross-cutting programs that we want to work on. The first of these is increasing global research capacity in epidemiology of arts. So we've got a number of really nice initiatives here. We're following all the open science practices, so we'll be sharing all the code and including how we've done data harmonization between cohorts, the code for that as well, for people who then can get access to the same cohort data themselves. We have these monthly training webinars, which will be covering different topics that could inform epidemiological research on arts. We're also going to be doing researcher exchanges between those, between the postdocs who are going to be employed across Japan, Malawi, Chile, and the UK on this grant. But we also have some really nice external opportunities as well. One of these is around micro-residencies. So micro-residencies are for researchers who are outside the project to come and spend up to a month working with us on the project in one of our 4 hubs. So in the UK, Japan, Malawi, or Chile. These will be funded opportunities, including travel and living costs during that month. So if people are working, for example, as epidemiologists in other countries and want to come and gain experience, or they have new methods they want to apply, or they're working in other fields but feel they can bring fresh perspectives into this, then these will be, we hope, really lovely opportunities to engage with us and really helpful for us as well. These micro residencies are going to be advertised publicly. So we'll be letting people know through the newsletter about when these are available for people to apply on. And we also have a research intensive course, which is a week-long training program on arts and health broadly, which takes up to 50 students a year. It has scholarships for global majority participants and some scholarships as well for financial need for other attendees. We've actually just already filled up the one for 2026, but we'll be advertising 2027 this autumn. So again, you can keep an eye out. But all of these, so the open science, the training webinars, the micro residencies, and the research intensive will be publicly available again through the website. Something else we want to do in terms of research capacity is consider how we might be developing new research questions to go into cohort studies as well. We undoubtedly are going to find things in workstream 1 where aspects of arts engagement won't be well captured within the existing questions in the cohorts, but through the partners we've already confirmed, we'll be able to work with them about how we can adapt questions moving forwards or integrate questions into new cohorts as they're being developed. Another thing that we want to do is to really synthesize the workstream findings from this. So we'll be testing essentially whether this concept of art as a health behavior is a concept that can be spoken about globally, or whether this is a phenomenon that's perhaps not a universal, but more of a culturally specific effect. And we also want to be looking at how we can develop new fundamental principles for arts epidemiology to inform future work, particularly on the methodological side. And finally, we want to be working to inform policy through this. We have partnerships with WHO, UNESCO, and the Global Jameel Arts and Health Lab, which have got major programs of work in this space, including roadmaps to publish new epidemiological evidence reviews and policy briefings that we'll be co-authoring with them. And this will really allow us to ensure through the global work that these global policy documents are actually picking up on and amplifying findings from global studies rather than just the global north evidence base, which is what we only really have at the moment for such reports. So for information on any of these things, then this is our website. It's not the snappiest, but essentially if you go to the main page of sbbresearch.org, you can see a direct link to the GRACE-Epi webpage as well. And if you sign up to the SBB newsletter, then we will be sharing the updates and the opportunities to get involved through that newsletter as well. So just to finish, just to say that we're really excited to have such a wonderful team on this and looking forward to working with everybody. And we're hoping that the timing for this is really unique and exciting, because we are seeing quite a surge in activity from international policymakers like WHO and UNESCO in this space. And we're hoping that the advancements that we'll hopefully be bringing through GRACE-Epi in terms of definitions, frameworks and methods in epidemiology, as well as the developments of both global cohort data and biological data, will help us to really elucidate how deep-seated the health benefits of arts engagement go and be able to develop new research principles that will be able to guide this field moving forwards. So I'd just like to acknowledge all of the other investigators as I finish and say that I'm really happy to take any questions as well. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Daisy, for that overview of the GRACE-Epi programme of work. That's fantastic. And as Daisy said, we have time now for some questions. So if you haven't already, then do share these via the question and answer slot on Teams. I can see we had a few that came in about collaboration. And I think Daisy went on to pick up on that point, particularly with talking about different ways to get involved through the workshops that will be happening in the first year of GRACE-Epi, and also the micro residencies, which will be an exciting opportunity for people to connect and exchange experience and perspectives. Also these training webinars, which will be free and running monthly for the foreseeable future. So we're really excited about that. As Daisy said, the best way to stay in touch is through our newsletter, and I've posted a link to that in the chat. And you might also be interested to explore other parts of our website. I've posted the link to the GRACE-Epi page, but we also have our research papers library, which has freely accessible research on these topics and more. And there is also the training programme Daisy mentioned, the Arts Health Research Intensive, and also a free online course about arts, culture and heritage and their effects on our health, amongst a whole load of webinar recordings, policy briefs, evidence briefs. So it's a really rich website. I might be a bit biased, but I do think there's a lot of fantastic resources on there for you to freely explore. So I think that's probably collaboration covered, unless you have anything else to say on that, Daisy, but I can see we've got quite a few other questions that we can move on to.
I think good just to acknowledge that as part of the open science, we will be providing things like lay summaries, infographics, short animation videos about the findings as well as all the papers being published in open access and various presentations that we'll do on the findings too. So we hope that that suite of different kinds of resources will be helpful to different stakeholders, including those who might not work directly within epidemiology, but might still benefit from the findings.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Great. So I will move on to some of the other questions that have come through. One is specifically about the data sets. Will you consider to include the data sets in open public databases in EBI/EMBL?
I think it's important to acknowledge that the data that we're working with have already all been collected. So it's not us creating new cohort studies, it's us working with existing resources. So that means that we will be sharing all of the code that we create to analyze these cohort studies, including the code for how we are merging or harmonizing variables between the cohort studies. But it's not our right to share the cohort studies themselves. But we'll be sharing exactly which cohorts we're working with. So any researchers are welcome to apply and access those cohorts if they meet the criteria and that they wish to do that.
Super, thank you. Another question on definitions of engagement. So when you define engagement in cultural/artistic activities, do you differentiate between active versus passive engagement, i.e. reading a book versus creative writing, or hearing music versus playing an instrument?
This is very much what we're going to be finding out in Workstream 1, because when we look at this at the moment, in a lot of the Global North cohort data, there is often this distinction made between active and passive, but actually that might not be relevant at all. And actually the conversations we're already having with the Global South partners in this is suggesting that that's not necessarily a valid distinction that's going to have weight in other cultural contexts. So in Workstream 1, we're going to be coming up with new definitions and considerations about what are the components of arts engagement we need to be separating out in questions versus which things are better asked in terms of broader questions within the cohort studies. So that's one of the major theoretical developments that we will be working on over this first year.
Brilliant. Thank you. And a follow-up question, how can sustained engagement in arts or culture across life differ from the concept of cognitive reserve for predicting dementia development, for example?
Well, cognitive reserve is typically the sort of capital that we talk about as that can support and protect against symptoms of dementia. So essentially the resilience of the brain and its ability to cope, even as those symptoms might be accumulating pathologically. So arts engagement we are considering and has been considered in previous literature is it an activity that can help to build cognitive reserve. And now this is something that we've seen in other epidemiological studies from things like education, from physical activity, for example. One of the challenges, though, is it is still a contentious question because the symptoms of dementia actually often start prodromally, decades before they actually manifest as people's having scores on neurocognitive batteries, for example, that indicate dementia. So there's always been this question about, well, is it actually that the people who have got these very early symptoms of dementia within their brains are already behaving differently, for example, engaging less in activities that might then explain the relationship with dementia later on. This doesn't seem to be the case with some things like early education, because early years education does have that link through. The concept of cognitive reserve appears to have more weight within that. But what we want to do within GRACE-Epi is to look actually at some of the longer term follow-up, which is now emerging, because most of the previous analyses have looked at kind of 12, 14-year follow-ups, which are still within that prodromal period. But actually, we've now got the cohort data to look at more like 25-year follow-ups. So that's some of the analyses we'll be doing in the study, but also we'll be looking more at the biological mechanisms, as you saw from Augustin Ibanez's paper that I showed earlier in the slides, that can then look at more of the biological plausibility to explain those associations.
Thank you, brilliant. And a question, have you considered to include sleep or circadian biomarkers as additional indicators of healthy aging?
Really interesting question, and actually something that we're going to be doing, which I'm sure Augustin will talk about in the next webinar, is looking at biobehavioral clocks. So considering some of those phenotypic markers that are not just about biological markers, but about other aspects of our behavior, like sleep, that can be that can give us indications about aging. So that will be something we're looking at within workstream 3.
Brilliant. So yeah, another plug to sign up to the next webinar in this series, definitely. A question here, for the purpose of having low or middle income countries, specifically Latin American evidence, is there a way to access resources for research in Mexico? Is there a way to participate, maybe through micro-residencies? How would you recommend approaching an arts and health intervention for mental health in large organizations for valid evidence, include co-production arts for local definitions, for example? So there's quite a lot in there, but essentially thinking about the Latin American and particularly Mexican, how people can get involved, I feel like we might have covered through some of our other discussion, but any recommendations for approaching an arts and health intervention for mental health in large organizations, creating valid evidence, co-production and local definitions?
So co-production and local definitions is exactly what we're looking at in workstream 1. So that will be the focus of that workstream. And in terms of Mexico data, we do have data from Mexico and cohort data in workstream 2. So we will indeed be looking at that there as well. I would say that to keep checking out on our website with the resources, we only started this grant a couple of weeks ago, so there will be a lot more resources and opportunities showing up over the coming months for people to participate in, including some of those other kinds of outputs I mentioned that might be particularly relevant if people are thinking about how they can translate this into practice within organisations as well.
Thank you. A question, are you applying or testing any qualitative epidemiology methods as part of the project?
So we are focusing on quantitative data. This is a quantitative epidemiology project for work streams 2 and 3. But workstream 1 is all about qualitative methods to think about these conceptualizations, including creative participatory-based methods in workstream 1. So yes, they will very much be coming out in that. And we're also planning some methodological papers about how we are doing that work that we hope will inform other people doing similar work too.
Super. And if you are in the audience a qualitative researcher who would like to perhaps present some of your work or some of your methodological approaches in this webinar series, then definitely drop me an email and we'd love to talk about that. Okay, a question here. Looking at arts engagement as a health behaviour is very interesting. However, there may be some overlap with existing other health behaviours such as physical activity. For example, engagement in some forms of physical activities such as dancing or artistic sports can also be considered as arts engagement. What are your thoughts on the value of considering this when exploring the effects of arts on health and comparing it with physical activity?
Absolutely, we want to be considering other behaviours in this, other health behaviours. What we're doing is we're taking an exposome approach, so we're considering what are the other factors in people's lives, including physical activity, including other hobbies they might be involved in, social involvement, community involvements. And our key question is whether arts engagement has associations with outcomes independent of these other factors. So essentially saying, is there a link even when we've taken account of those other health behaviours? This is something that we've been doing in previous epidemiological papers, and it's also something that Augustin Ibanez, one of our investigators, is really specialist in this exposomic thinking. So it's very much the way that we're going to be designing that. I think that there are some things that are mentioned that might lie on a grey line, like whether dance is physical activity or is arts. With epidemiology, we always have to deal with the way that questions have been asked, and typically we find that physical activity questions they typically focus on things like frequency of physical activity engagement and whether it's high or low intensity. And arts questions tend to focus on the frequency and diversity, sometimes picking out specific behaviours. So we'll work with the data that we can to be able to think about what kind of behaviour it has the strongest associations. But some of this work might be things that we'll be able to provide some broader results on, but then can be taken forwards in experimental or other intervention work.
Thank you. I'll try and pick up some questions that have come through in the chat as well. So one question, is the book Art Cure covering some of these types of research or about something else?
Yes, it very much is. It's covering all of the evidence base on arts and health, so including epidemiology as well as experimental and other kinds of evidence too. I can put a link in the chat if you're interested.
Brilliant. Yeah, go ahead. And Ingrid, I think I can answer this one. So will the monthly training seminars be informed through the newsletter? Absolutely. We'll share all details of upcoming opportunities through that newsletter. So that's a really great thing to sign up to. Then another question on the theme of collaboration. Thank you so much for the presentation on such an exciting project. Are you partnering with any arts organisations and or museums, galleries, etc.? And this maybe links to another question we had, which was, are you collaborating with doctors or GPs, paediatricians? So any comments on that?
So in terms of the arts organisations, absolutely, yes. We're working with the Global Cultural Districts Network, which involves, I think it's 65 different countries with arts organisations in it. And we also are working with Global South Arts and Health Network, which brings together arts organisations and artists specifically working in health, and also Arts and Global Health Centre Africa. So we have some wonderful arts partners. Obviously, it's a challenge with a really big international project like this about how you can manage partners in every country. So our approach has been that we're working with network partners that themselves have lots of partners at local levels. So those key network partners will be responsible for how they then think about disseminating or engaging those cultural partners in the individual countries. And in terms of GPs and healthcare professionals, we'll be providing all these other kinds of outputs. For example, I mentioned earlier through the open science strands, and also lots of policy reports that undoubtedly will have a relevance on that. And we also welcome people who might be from clinical backgrounds to consider things like the Research Intensive programme, the webinars, contributing a webinar, and also the micro residencies programme when those are advertised.
Super, thank you so much. And I can see we have Georgios from Greece, who was saying that they've been teaching arts for several years and they're interested in participating in new research somehow. I know there's quite a lot of activity in Greece, so I'm sure that's something that drop us a line, or you can sign up to our newsletter to hear about future opportunities. But I think we'd be very happy to hear from you.
And we do have cohort data from Greece as well within the analyses.
Brilliant. So there'll be some exciting findings to share, hopefully in due course. We've had thank yous coming in already. Appreciate we're moving into the last 5 minutes of the webinar. So if there is a burning question, now is the moment to type that in, but we'll see if we can get through a couple more that I can see. So there are some interesting studies about the health of immigrants, their children, and health of related cohorts in their home countries. Are any of your studies looking at changes in arts engagement between immigrants, first generations, and peer cohorts in the countries of origin?
So the focus with this particular project is looking at the relationship between arts and health outcomes. So absolutely, we'll be considering things like immigration status within as potential confounders within this. But we're not going to be tracking specifically rates of engagement in different countries. However, we do have collaborations with UNESCO that are happening alongside this, where we're looking at how we can do this using their framework for cultural statistics. So I would say still look at our newsletter, because there'll probably be other work coming out on this in parallel to GRACE-Epi.
Super, thank you. And our last question is picking up on socio-economic factors and low-income factors. So I guess this is something that you've mentioned will be included in the analysis, but did you want to expand on this anymore?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that bit.
That's okay. It was Michelle asking, what about socio-economic factors or low-income factors? And I assume you're interested in how these play in.
That is a huge part of our compounding structures that we're having to account for, because we do know that in so many countries, arts engagement has that social gradient. So it's always absolutely pivotal that we try and ensure that the associations that we find are not actually just due to spurious confounding structures that we've not been able to account for in the analyses. I think statistical triangulation is often the best way forwards here, where we can use different methods, some of which might involve conditioning on those confounders, some of which might involve using methods that automatically take account of trait confounders, like fixed effects methods, some of which might involve stratified analyses or moderation analyses. So we'll be considering to using a whole bunch of those methods together and seeing whether we consistently find the associations regardless of which method we're using to account for socioeconomic factors.
Super, thank you. I might suggest that we wrap up the Q&A there, because I think we have hopefully managed to cover most of the questions there, but it's an open invitation to get in touch if you'd like to discuss further, and hopefully we'll be able to share lots of updates with you over the coming months as we kind of fully kick into gear with the project. So just leaves with me to say thank you for taking the time to join and find out about GRACE-Epi. We'll be following up over email with some useful links, which will include this webinar recording to watch back. Do sign up to our newsletter for those future updates about the GRACE-Epi programme. We'll be sharing opportunities and resources through that. Our next webinar we're really excited about is Thursday, the 26th of February. So do get your ticket for that, and we really look forward to seeing you there and continuing the conversation. And as I said, please get in touch if you're interested in co-hosting a monthly methods session in the future. We would love to hear from you. But thank you for all of the engagement, comments and questions. And thank you, Daisy, as well, for that presentation.